This unit focuses on the issue of social stratification. Stratification refers to divisions among people. When we speak about social stratification, we're usually referring to differences in status, things like wealth, power, or prestige. Historically, there have been three main systems of stratification that are studied by sociologists: slavery, caste, and class. Slavery is a system of stratification in which some people are owned or treated as property by other people. Historically, slavery has looked very different in different times and different places. We see primarily three traditional causes of slavery. The first is debt. People unable to pay debts might be subjected to slavery. People also might be sold by their parents or relatives, or might sell themselves as indentured servants. Workhouse children during the Victorian era provide one example of this. Some people might also end up being enslaved as a result of crime. It might be a way for them to pay off their debt. And finally, one of the common ways people ended up as slaves was that they were the spoils of war. Conditions of slavery have also varied tremendously. In some cases, slavery was seen as a temporary condition, not necessarily an inherited status. And not all slaves were necessarily poor and powerless, depending on the time and place. The type of slavery with which you are probably most familiar is the type that took place here in the Americas. While attempts to enslave the indigenous population largely failed, large numbers of slaves were imported from the continent of Africa. Many people mistakenly believe that racist ideologies are what fueled the exportation of this type of slaves, but many social scientists believe that rather ideologies of race became a way to defend the importation of slave labor, not the justification for it. This system was a heritable system, and people were bred for profit, making it a particularly cruel example of slavery. Unfortunately, slavery continues to exist in the world today. Some people highlight the ways that extreme economic exploitation are akin to slavery. In addition, we know that 8 to 9 million children are currently enslaved, and a much larger number are exploited workers. Women and children across the globe are trafficked as low-wage workers, slaves, and as sexual slaves. Caste refers to a system in which birth determines your lifelong status. While people often associate caste systems with India, British, French, and Spanish monarchical systems are also an example of a caste system. Caste systems tend to practice what's called endogamy. One will marry those at the same station or level. Class systems are more common in the world today. Class systems purport to have high levels of social mobility, and marriage across class lines is not considered problematic. However, in reality, in most class systems we see today, class mobility is significantly limited, and most people do tend to marry within their own social class. Scholars have noted the emergence of a global superclass. The global superclass refers to about 6,000 of the richest people in the world. The richest 1,000 people in the world have more wealth than the poorest 2.5 billion put together. The global superclass tends to be male, and it tends to be white, and it tends to hail from the Northern Hemisphere. Among classic sociological theorists, Marx and Weber had the most to say about class. Marx is considered to be what's called an economic determinist. For Marx, social class depends entirely on your relationship to the means of production. There are really only two classes with which he's concerned: the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, who are the workers. Marx argues that because of your shared identity, you may develop class consciousness. However, he argues that false consciousness often ensues, in which workers think of themselves as capitalists rather than labor. What this means in practice is that we often see labor supporting political candidates or bills that maybe aren't beneficial to the workers themselves. Weber has a more nuanced view of class. For Weber, there's three components that could raise or lower your class status. Your class, the property or wealth to which you have access, your status, or prestige, this would come from positions you may hold, or your power, your ability to control others. One of the obvious questions about stratification is it universal, and why so? Many sociologists have argued that stratification is universal. The structural functionalists were the first to tackle this argument, and though their argument has in the end been discredited, it's important to take a look at what it was. Davis and Moore argued that stratification is inevitable or will definitely happen because, first of all, we need all of our important positions filled. Secondly, some positions have more importance than others, and you need to motivate people to take those positions. Right. Third, the more important a position, the more qualifications are required. Why would you spend years in medical school if there wasn't a big reward from being a doctor? And lastly, to motivate people, we use these rewards. This theory has largely been discredited for a number of reasons. The structural functionalist argument is deceptively simple. Tooman points out that how do you decide what's important to a society? Maybe we should question this. Tooman, for example, points out that having our trash picked up is actually more integral to our health than necessarily having a good heart surgeon. Yet the rewards for being a heart surgeon are commensurately much higher than for being a sanitation engineer. Secondly, Tooman points out that society is clearly not a meritocracy. People who work the hardest might not get ahead. In fact, social class is the best predictor for access to things like education. Well, that's just simply the class into which you were born. And thirdly, Tooman points out that social stratification works out very well for the privileged and is fairly dysfunctional for everyone else in society. So maybe we need to rethink this idea of what is functional. Conflict theorists take a different tack. They argue that conflict is actually the cause of stratification, that those with more power or privilege use their position to maintain power. And this is how stratification occurs. Mosca, for example, points out that all societies are stratified by power. There's something different about leadership and everyone else. Secondly, Mosca points out that leadership requires there to be power imbalances. And thirdly, that once people achieve a position of power, they tend to reward themselves. Sociologists argue that stratification is perpetuated in a number of ways. First is the control of ideas. Ideologies tend to favor those in power. Second, the control of information. This is linked to the control of ideas. By limiting access to information, you're ultimately controlling which ideologies have the most purchase or traction. Limiting criticism. You could limit criticism legally or simply through control of the media. And lastly, the use of surveillance technology to monitor your citizenry.